Victor Langford was not used to being ignored, especially not in his own boardroom. And the longer Emily Carter stood there without reacting, the more the subtle tension began to shift into something sharper, something that made him lean back in his chair with a faint smile that no longer looked entirely confident, but rather carefully maintained, as if he needed the room to stay on his side. "I am going to assume this is a misunderstanding," he continued, his voice smooth but edged with impatience, "because this meeting is restricted to senior leadership only." And a few heads around the table nodded instinctively, their agreement less about policy and more about preserving the unspoken hierarchy that governed every inch of that space, where status was measured before words were even spoken. Emily's gaze moved slowly across the room, not searching for approval, not asking for permission, but observing, taking in each face, each expression, each quiet judgment that had already been made about her. And still she said nothing, her silence stretching just long enough to make one of the junior executives shift uncomfortably in his seat, clearing his throat as if to break the moment. While the large digital clock on the wall ticked past 9:02 a.m., its soft mechanical rhythm suddenly louder than usual, marking time in a room that had grown increasingly aware that something was not unfolding as expected. "Security can escort you out," Victor added, this time more directly, his tone firmer, signaling that the performance was over and control needed to be reasserted. And across the glass walls, a uniformed guard straightened at the subtle cue, his posture attentive but hesitant, because even he could sense that something about this situation did not fully align with the usual patterns. And yet protocol was protocol, and hesitation in a place like this was rarely rewarded. Emily finally took a step forward, not toward the exit, but toward the long table itself, her movement slow, deliberate, drawing every eye in the room with a quiet authority that did not match her appearance. And for a brief second, Victor's expression faltered, just slightly, as if his instincts were trying to catch up with something his assumptions had already dismissed. "I said this meeting is restricted," he repeated, more sharply now, but his words did not land the way they had before, because the room was no longer fully with him, curiosity beginning to replace certainty, and that shift, however small, was enough to create a crack in the confidence he had been relying on. Emily placed her hand lightly on the back of one of the empty chairs, her fingers resting there as if she had every right to be exactly where she stood, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, and unexpectedly grounded. "Then it seems someone forgot to update the guest list," she said, not confrontational, not defensive, but precise, as if she were stating a simple fact rather than responding to a challenge. And that single sentence carried just enough weight to ripple through the room in a way no one had anticipated, because it did not sound like someone trying to explain herself. It sounded like someone quietly correcting an oversight. Victor let out a short laugh, but it lacked the easy confidence it had carried before. "And who exactly are you supposed to be?" he asked, leaning forward again, this time searching her face more carefully, as if trying to reconcile the disconnect between what he saw and what he was beginning to feel. And for a moment, Emily's expression softened almost imperceptibly, not in weakness, but in something closer to recognition, like someone standing in a place filled with echoes of a past no one else in the room could see. And then, just as she opened her mouth to respond, a faint sound cut through the tension, the soft chime of the executive elevator at the far end of the hall, followed by the unmistakable rhythm of measured footsteps approaching across the marble floor, each step deliberate, unhurried, carrying a presence that did not need to announce itself to be recognized. And one by one, the executives around the table straightened instinctively, their attention shifting away from Emily and toward the entrance, because in that building, there was only one person whose arrival could silence a room without a single word. And as the sound grew closer, Victor's posture stiffened, his earlier certainty giving way to something far less comfortable, something that had not yet formed into realization but was already beginning to unsettle him in a way he could not quite explain. The sound of those footsteps did not rush, did not hesitate. It moved with the quiet certainty of someone who had never needed to prove his authority. And as the figure appeared at the glass doorway, the entire room shifted almost instinctively, chairs straightening, voices falling silent, even the air itself seeming to tighten in recognition. Because Robert Langford did not enter rooms, he changed them. And the moment his presence filled the space, every executive at that table rose to their feet without being asked, a reflex built over years of understanding exactly where power truly resided. Victor stood as well, but not with the same ease he had carried moments before, his movements just a fraction slower, his expression carefully composed as he adjusted his jacket, forcing a confident smile that no longer quite matched the tension beginning to form beneath it. "Chairman Langford, we were just about to begin," he said, his tone respectful, controlled, but carrying a faint urgency, as if he wanted to re-establish order before anything else could unfold. Robert Langford did not respond immediately, his gaze moving across the room with a calm precision that took in everything without appearing to linger on anything, until it stopped, not on Victor, not on the reports laid out across the table, but on Emily, and for a brief moment, something softened in his expression, something personal, something that did not belong to the corporate world surrounding them. The room noticed. They did not understand it, but they felt it, that subtle shift that carried more weight than any spoken word, and one by one, their attention returned to the woman they had dismissed just minutes earlier, now standing at the edge of the table, as if she had been waiting not for permission, but for this exact moment to arrive. "Emily," Robert said, his voice steady, clear, carrying across the room without effort, and the effect was immediate. Victor's smile froze mid-expression, his posture stiffening as if his body had reacted before his mind could catch up, because that name had not been spoken the way one addresses a stranger. It had been spoken with familiarity, with recognition, with a quiet authority that left no room for interpretation. Emily met his gaze, her composure unchanged, but there was a faint shift now, something almost imperceptible, like a weight she had been carrying quietly was finally being set down, and as she stepped fully into the room, leaving the threshold behind her, the distance between her and the long table no longer felt like a barrier, but like a space she had already crossed long before she arrived. "I hope I am not late," she said calmly, her voice measured, and Robert gave the slightest nod, the kind that did not need to be explained, "right on time." He replied, and that single exchange landed with more force than anything that had been said before, because it confirmed what no one in that room had even considered possible just minutes earlier. Victor's eyes flicked between them, his mind racing, searching for an explanation that would restore the certainty he had lost. "Chairman, I was not aware that we had an additional guest," he said carefully, choosing his words with precision, but the subtle strain beneath his voice was impossible to hide now, and Robert turned his attention to him, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with a calm that felt far more unsettling. "She is not a guest," he said simply, and the room seemed to hold its breath, every person present leaning into the silence that followed, because something was about to be revealed, something that would not just explain the moment, but redefine everything that had happened leading up to it. And as Robert's gaze returned to Emily, there was no longer any ambiguity left in the room, only anticipation, sharp and undeniable, as the truth hovered just seconds away from breaking through the carefully constructed assumptions that had already begun to crumble. The silence did not break immediately, it deepened, stretching across the room like a quiet force that pressed against every assumption sitting at that table, and Victor Langford felt it first, not as understanding, but as pressure, something tightening in his chest as his mind struggled to reconcile the chairman's words with everything he had just witnessed, because nothing about the situation made sense anymore, not the calm in Emily's posture, not the way Robert Langford had said her name, and certainly not the certainty in his voice when he declared she was not a guest. Emily stepped forward then, not hesitantly, not seeking permission, but with the kind of quiet confidence that did not announce itself, her hand leaving the back of the chair as she moved around the table, her footsteps measured, steady, drawing every eye with her as if the room itself had shifted its center of gravity, and when she reached the head of the table, the seat that had remained empty until now, she paused for just a fraction of a second, her fingers brushing lightly against the polished wood, and in that moment, the weight of everything unsaid settled into place. Robert watched her without interruption, his expression composed but unmistakably approving, as if this moment had been expected, even designed, And when Emily finally turned to face the room, her gaze moved across each person slowly, deliberately, not with resentment, not with triumph, but with clarity, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are in a room that has already misjudged you. "Allow me to clarify," she said, her voice calm, steady, carrying without effort, and no one interrupted, no one shifted, because the room had already begun to understand that whatever came next would redefine everything that had happened before. "My name is Emily Carter," she continued, and for a brief second, the name sounded the same as it had earlier, simple, unremarkable. But now it carried a weight that had not been there before. "And as of this quarter, I hold majority interest in Langford Industries." And the words did not land all at once. They settled, slowly, heavily, like something the room needed time to absorb, because majority interest was not a title that could be dismissed. It was control, it was authority, it was power in its most undeniable form. A faint sound escaped someone near the far end of the table. Not quite a gasp, not quite a word, just the natural reaction of a mind catching up to reality. While Victor remained completely still, his expression frozen in a way that no longer resembled confidence, his earlier certainty unraveling piece by piece as the implications of her statement took hold. And for the first time since she had entered the room, he did not have an immediate response, because there was no room left for interpretation, no space to correct the narrative he had already built. Emily let the silence sit for a moment longer, not rushing to fill it, allowing the weight of her words to settle fully, and then she added, almost gently, which also means, her tone unchanged, "This is not a meeting I was invited to. It is one I am responsible for." And that single clarification completed the shift entirely, turning what had begun as quiet dismissal into undeniable recognition. Robert Langford gave a slight nod, the kind that confirmed everything without needing further explanation, and across the table, executives who had once leaned back in casual confidence now sat forward, their expressions tightened with realization, their earlier judgments now hanging unspoken in the air between them, because in less than 10 minutes, the person they had dismissed as an outsider had become the single most important presence in the room, and there was nothing they could say to undo it. Victor finally moved, just slightly, his hand adjusting his sleeve in a gesture that tried to recover some sense of control, but the movement felt smaller now, diminished, as if the room itself had shifted beyond his reach, and when he opened his mouth to speak, the words did not come immediately, because for the first time, he was no longer certain of what position he held, not just in the meeting, but in the company itself. And that uncertainty, quiet but undeniable, settled into the room, like a truth no one could ignore. No one spoke at first, not because they did not want to, but because they no longer knew how. And in a room where control had always been measured by who spoke the loudest, silence had suddenly become the most powerful presence of all, pressing down on every person seated at that table as the reality of Emily Carter's words continued to settle in, not as a shock anymore, but as a truth that could not be undone. Victor Langford finally cleared his throat, the sound slightly sharper than intended, his usual composure replaced by something more calculated, more careful, as he attempted to rebuild the authority that had slipped through his grasp just moments earlier. "If that is the case," he began, choosing each word with deliberate precision, "then there must have been a communication oversight." And his tone, while still formal, no longer carried the same certainty, because now it was no longer about correcting her. It was about correcting himself without admitting fault, a subtle shift that did not go unnoticed by anyone in the room. Emily listened without interrupting, her posture relaxed but grounded, as if she had already anticipated this response, and when Victor finished, she gave a slight nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "There was," she said calmly, her voice steady, "but not the kind you are suggesting." And that quiet correction landed with more weight than any accusation could have, because it did not raise its volume. It raised its clarity. She moved her hand to the folder resting at the head of the table, opening it with a smooth, unhurried motion, and inside were documents, clean, organized, precise, the kind that did not need explanation because their existence spoke for itself. And as she slid one across the polished surface toward Victor, the faint sound of paper against wood seemed louder than it should have been. drawing every eye to the single page now sitting in front of him, waiting. Victor hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before reaching forward, his fingers tightening slightly as he picked it up, and as his eyes scanned the document. The shift in his expression was immediate, subtle at first, then undeniable, the controlled confidence giving way to recognition, then to something closer to realization, because what he was holding was not just a confirmation of ownership. It was a timeline, signatures, approvals, internal memos that had been distributed weeks ago, communications that had passed through the very channels he oversaw, and for the first time, the possibility that this moment was not sudden, but entirely preventable, settled into his thoughts. Around the table, executives leaned forward, their curiosity no longer hidden, their earlier detachment replaced by an urgency to understand how something this significant had unfolded without their awareness, and more importantly, how they had all played a role in overlooking it, not because the information was hidden, but because they had not considered it important enough to notice. Emily closed the folder gently, the soft click of its edges aligning marking the end of the explanation she did not need to elaborate on. And then she looked up, her gaze moving across the room once more, not with judgment, but with a quiet expectation. Langford Industries does not have a communication problem, she said evenly. It has an attention problem, and the words were not harsh, not raised, but they carried a precision that made them impossible to ignore because they did not attack. They revealed. Victor lowered the document slowly, his posture no longer leaning forward, no longer commanding, but adjusting, recalibrating, as if he were trying to find a position that still held weight in a room that had already shifted beyond his control. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, more measured. It appears we may need to review internal processes, he said, attempting to redirect the conversation toward structure, towards something procedural, something that could be managed. But Emily did not follow that path. We will, she replied, her tone unchanged, starting with this room. And that statement, simple and direct, settled into the space with a finality that made it clear the conversation was no longer about what had happened, but about what would happen next. And in that moment, every person present understood that the dynamic they had relied on, the assumptions they had trusted, and the confidence they had carried into that meeting had all been quietly, completely redefined, not through confrontation, not through force, but through a single presence they had underestimated from the very beginning. The room did not return to normal after that, because something fundamental had shifted, something that could not simply be smoothed over with formal language or redirected into agenda items. And for the first time in a long time, the executives seated around that table were no longer thinking about numbers or projections. They were thinking about themselves, about what they had seen, what they had said, and more importantly, what they had failed to recognize. Emily Carter remained standing at the head of the table, not rushing to sit, not claiming the space with any dramatic gesture, but holding it with a quiet certainty that made it clear she did not need to assert authority for it to be understood. And Robert Langford, still positioned just behind her, watched the room with a composed expression that revealed nothing and yet confirmed everything. Because his silence now was no longer neutral, it was supportive, deliberate, reinforcing the shift that had already taken place. We will begin with a simple question, Emily said, her voice steady, cutting through the lingering tension without raising in volume, and every person in the room instinctively focused on her, not out of obligation, but because they now understood that ignoring her was no longer an option. How many of you reviewed the internal memorandum distributed 3 weeks ago regarding leadership restructuring? The question was direct, precise, and it landed without warning, because it did not reference what had just happened. It exposed the foundation beneath it. And for a moment, no one answered, the silence stretching again, but this time it carried a different weight, not confusion, but accountability. One executive shifted slightly, glancing down at his notes. Another adjusted her glasses, buying time, while a third gave a hesitant nod, though it was unclear whether it was an answer or an attempt to appear engaged. And Victor Langford, seated now rather than standing, felt the pressure of the question settle directly on him, because if anyone in that room was expected to have read and understood that memorandum, it was him. I did, he said finally, his voice controlled, though not as firm as before, and Emily turned her gaze toward him, not sharply, not confrontationally, but with a focus that made the rest of the room fade slightly in comparison. "Then you were aware of the changes to executive authority," she replied, and the statement was not framed as a question, which made it more difficult to deflect, and Victor paused, just briefly, before answering. The document outlined potential adjustments pending. "Board approval," he said carefully, emphasizing the uncertainty, the conditional nature of the language, as if that distinction could restore some balance. Emily gave a small nod, acknowledging the response without conceding to it. "The board approved those changes 48 hours after that memorandum was sent," she said calmly, and a faint shift moved through the room again, subtle but undeniable, as a few executives exchanged quick glances, recalculating their understanding of events, realizing that what had been presented as potential had already become reality, and that the delay was not in decision-making, but in their awareness. Emily stepped slightly closer to the table, her presence drawing the room in again, not through force, but through clarity, "which means," she continued, her tone even, "this was not a surprise announcement. It was a missed recognition." And the distinction settled heavily, because it reframed the entire situation from something unexpected into something overlooked, and that carried a different kind of responsibility, one that could not be dismissed as easily. Victor lowered his gaze momentarily, not in defeat, but in calculation, as if searching for a position from which he could respond without further exposing the gap that had just been revealed. And when he looked back up, there was a shift in his expression, subtle but real, the confidence now tempered with something closer to caution. "It seems there was a lapse in communication within the executive chain," he said, attempting once more to distribute the weight across the system rather than hold it individually. But Emily did not move away from the point. "Communication requires attention," she replied, her voice still calm, still measured, but now carrying a clarity that made the distinction unmistakable. "And attention is a choice." And that sentence, simple as it was, settled deeper than anything else she had said, because it did not accuse, it defined, and in doing so, it left very little room for interpretation. The room fell quiet again, not from uncertainty this time, but from understanding, and in that silence, the realization became complete, not just that Emily Carter held authority, but that she had revealed something far more significant, something about how easily power can be misread when it does not look the way people expect it to. And as that thought settled into the minds of everyone present, the meeting that had begun with quiet dismissal had transformed into something else entirely. Something far more deliberate, far more controlled, and far more revealing than anyone in that room had anticipated when the doors first opened. What unsettled the room was not just the realization that they had overlooked something important, but the growing awareness that the oversight had not been accidental. It had been shaped by assumption, by the quiet belief that authority would always look a certain way, dress a certain way, speak a certain way, and Emily Carter stood as the contradiction to all of it, calm, composed, and entirely unmoved by the shift she had just created. She did not raise her voice, she did not demand acknowledgement, and yet every person in that room was now paying closer attention than they had at any point before. "There is another question we need to address," she said, her tone measured, drawing the focus back to her without effort, and the executives straightened almost instinctively, their posture no longer casual, their attention sharpened, because they understood now that this was no longer a routine meeting, it was an evaluation. Emily's gaze moved deliberately across the table until it settled once more on Victor Langford, not as a challenge, but as a point of clarity. "What is the first responsibility of leadership?" she asked, and the question hung in the air, simple on the surface, but layered in a way that made it difficult to answer without exposing something deeper. A few seconds passed before someone at the far end spoke cautiously. "To guide the company toward growth," he said, his voice steady but uncertain, and another added, "to protect shareholder value," while a third offered, "to make strategic decisions based on data." Each answer technically correct, each one reflecting the kind of thinking that had always defined success in that room. But none of them seemed to fully satisfy the silence that followed. Emily listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, and then she gave a small nod, acknowledging the responses before shifting her focus again. "Those are outcomes," she said calmly. not responsibilities. And the distinction landed immediately, reframing the conversation in a way that made the previous answers feel incomplete rather than wrong. She stepped slightly closer to the table, her presence drawing the room inward once again. The first responsibility of leadership is awareness, she continued, her voice steady, deliberate. Awareness of people, of context, of what is in front of you before you decide what it means. And as she spoke, her words did not rise in volume, but they deepened in impact because they were no longer abstract. They were directly connected to what had just occurred. Victor felt the weight of that connection more than anyone else, not because he had been singled out, but because he understood, perhaps more clearly than the others, exactly what she was pointing to, and for the first time, his response did not come quickly. Awareness requires information, he said finally, his tone more careful now, less assertive, as if he were testing the ground before stepping forward, and Emily nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth in that statement. And information requires attention, she replied, completing the thought with quiet precision, which brings us back to where we began. The room fell silent again, but this time it was not a silence of uncertainty, it was one of recognition, because the pattern had become clear, the connection undeniable, and the moment they had dismissed as insignificant had now become the center of the entire discussion. Emily let that realization settle before continuing, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged. What happened this morning was not just a misunderstanding, she said, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. It was a demonstration, and that word carried weight, because it suggested intention, purpose, something designed rather than accidental, and several executives exchanged quick glances, their expressions tightening as the implication began to form. A demonstration of what happens when perception replaces observation, she added, and now the connection was complete, the lesson fully drawn, not through accusation, but through clarity, and in that moment, the room understood that they had not just been participants in a meeting, they had been participants in something far more deliberate, something that had exposed a flaw not in their systems, but in their thinking. And as that realization settled into place, the authority Emily held no longer needed to be stated. It had already been proven, quietly, precisely, and in a way none of them would forget. By the time Emily Carter finished speaking, the room no longer felt like a place of authority. It felt like a place of reflection, as if every person seated at that table had been quietly pulled out of their certainty and placed face to face with something far less comfortable, something that could not be explained away with titles or experience. And for the first time that morning, no one rushed to respond, because there was nothing left to defend, only something to understand. Victor Langford sat still, his hands resting on the edge of the table, no longer gesturing, no longer commanding attention, and though his posture remained composed, the shift in his presence was undeniable, because the confidence that once filled his voice had been replaced with something more measured, something that suggested he was no longer trying to control the room, but to recalibrate his place within it. Emily allowed the silence to settle fully before moving again, her steps slow and deliberate as she finally took the seat at the head of the table, not as a dramatic claim, but as a natural conclusion to everything that had already been established. And as she sat, the movement itself carried a quiet finality, the kind that does not demand recognition because it has already been earned. Robert Langford took his place beside her, not ahead, not above, but beside, reinforcing without words what had already been made clear, and the executives, one by one, followed, taking their seats again, but this time with a different awareness, their posture more attentive, their expressions more focused, because the dynamic of the room had changed in a way that could not be reversed. "We will continue," Emily said calmly, her voice steady, transitioning the moment without dismissing it. And as she opened the folder in front of her, the familiar rhythm of a meeting began to return, but it was not the same rhythm as before. It carried a different tone, one shaped by everything that had just taken place. She began outlining the next quarter's strategic priorities, her words precise, structured, moving through financial projections, operational adjustments, and leadership expectations with a clarity that left little room for confusion. And as she spoke, the room followed, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, because it was now evident that her authority was not defined by her position alone. but by her understanding, her preparation, and the quiet control with which she guided the conversation forward. Victor listened carefully, his attention fixed not just on the content, but on the way she delivered it, the way she moved between details and decisions without hesitation, and for the first time, he saw not the person he had dismissed, but the leader he had failed to recognize, and that realization, though subtle, carried more weight than any correction he could have made earlier. At one point, Emily paused, her gaze lifting from the documents to meet his directly, not to confront, but to include. "Your division will be leading the implementation phase," she said evenly, and the statement, simple as it was, carried a layer of meaning that extended beyond the task itself, because it was not a dismissal, not a punishment, but an expectation, a quiet indication that the standard had not been lowered, it had been clarified. Victor gave a slight nod, his response measured. "Understood," he said, and though the word was brief, it marked a shift, not just in tone, but in perspective, because for the first time that morning, he was no longer responding from assumption, but from awareness. The meeting continued, numbers discussed, timelines adjusted, responsibilities assigned, but beneath the surface of every exchange, there remained a quiet understanding, a shared recognition of what had been revealed and what had been corrected. And as the final agenda item concluded, Emily closed her folder gently, the soft sound echoing just enough to draw the room's attention one last time. She looked around the table, her gaze steady, not searching for approval, not expecting acknowledgement, but offering something far more deliberate. "What we build here does not begin with strategy," she said calmly. "It begins with how we see each other before we decide what someone is worth." And the words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not as a lecture, not as a reprimand, but as a truth that no one could ignore. And as the meeting came to an end, no one spoke immediately. Because in that moment, they all understood that what had changed was not just the structure of leadership, but the way they would see it from that day forward. The meeting ended not with noise, but with a silence that felt different from the one that had filled the room earlier. This one was not built on uncertainty or hesitation. It was built on understanding. And as the executives slowly gathered their documents and rose from their seats, there was no rush to leave, no casual conversations picking up where they had left off, because something about the room had changed in a way that followed them even as they stood. Emily Carter remained seated for a moment longer, her hands resting lightly on the closed folder in front of her, her posture calm, composed, as if the weight of the morning had never pressed on her at all. And across from her, Victor Langford hesitated, just briefly, before stepping forward, not with the confidence he had carried earlier, but with a measured intention that suggested something had shifted beneath the surface. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice steady, though quieter than before, and the formality of her name carried a different tone now, one shaped not by distance, but by recognition. "I owe you an acknowledgement." And the room, though beginning to clear, seemed to pause again, attention subtly returning to the exchange. Emily looked up at him, her expression unchanged, not expectant, not dismissive, simply present, and Victor held her gaze for a moment before continuing. "What happened earlier was a failure on my part to observe before I judged," he said, each word deliberate, not rushed, not defensive, but clear, and in that statement, there was no attempt to redirect responsibility, no effort to soften the truth, only a recognition of it, and that alone carried more weight than any apology shaped for convenience. Emily listened, her posture still, her attention focused, and when he finished, she gave a slight nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement. "Awareness is not something you declare," she replied calmly. "It is something you practice." And her words, though simple, carried the same quiet precision that had defined the entire morning, because they did not close the moment, they extended it into something ongoing, something that would be measured not by what was said now, but by what would be done after. Victor accepted that without resistance, his nod subtle but genuine, and for a brief second, the tension that had defined their earlier interaction dissolved into something more balanced, something grounded in understanding rather than assumption. One by one, the remaining executives exited the room, their steps quieter than before, their conversations more measured, as if each of them carried a piece of the realization that had unfolded. And as the doors closed softly behind them, the expansive glass walls no longer felt like barriers separating power from the outside world, but reflections of a moment that had reshaped how that power would be seen from within. Robert Langford remained by the window, his gaze directed toward the city skyline, stretching beyond the tower, and after a moment, he spoke, his voice calm, carrying the quiet authority that had defined his presence from the beginning. "You handled that exactly as it needed to be handled," he said, not as praise, but as recognition, and Emily allowed herself a faint, almost imperceptible smile, not of triumph, but of completion, as if something long prepared had finally reached its intended moment. She stood then, smoothing her sleeves slightly, her movements unhurried, and as she walked toward the door, she paused for just a second, her hand resting on the handle, her reflection faintly visible in the glass, not as the person who had entered that building earlier, but as the one who had redefined it from the inside. And in that quiet pause, there was no need for further words, no need for explanation, because the lesson had already been delivered, not through force, not through confrontation, but through a single undeniable truth, that respect is never determined by appearance,